Hello and welcome to this short screencast about scaffolding. My name's Graham Bell and I'm going to take you through this. So, let's have a look. What is scaffolding? So, this picture is actually a really good example and a nice way of explaining what scaffolding is. So, that first picture on your left hand side there, you can see that there's a learner looking perplexed as they look up to this piece of knowledge that they're trying to get to. And they've got no way of getting there. They've got no prior knowledge to build on. They've got nothing to hook onto at all. Scaffolding is something that we as teachers put in place to help children make the small steps to gain that piece of knowledge. So we construct that scaffolding around the piece of knowledge that they're learning to make it easier for children to ascend, climb up to, access that learning. And that can come in many different variations. You know, it can be questions, it can be resources, it can be prompts, it can be writing frames. But essentially, it all comes down to the same idea. It's something that's designed to help a person reach the learning. That's the goal. And like scaffolding, real life scaffolding around buildings, you can deconstruct it. You can take elements of it away. So as children become more secure with that knowledge, as they become more secure with the processes and the knowledge, you can start to remove the scaffolding away until you get back to the point where the children don't need the scaffolding at all to be able to do it. So scaffolding is in essence the small stepping stones that children need to take. So the small steps they need to take to get to the piece of learning. And we as teachers or competent peers with the children help them to make the right steps to get to the knowledge. Now, the difficulty for you as a teacher is to know what scaffolding you need to be putting in place for children to be able to get where they need to go. And that comes from knowing your children, so having a really good understanding of who they are, where they are in their learning journey, and what steps they need to take. And therefore, you also have to have a good subject knowledge on the subject you're teaching so that you know what the next logical step is for that child to make to help them get to where they're going. So a big part of classroom life is collaboration, and that is developed through collaborative learning strategies. Now, we as teachers need to be aware that children have to learn these skills. It's not something that is natural and inherent in all children. So it's something that we have to scaffold and we have to teach explicitly through approaches. Because we need to get children to the stage where they're working comfortably in small groups and working together to get to expected learning outcomes. Now, one of the ways that we'll do this is through frameworks, where we'll provide things for children to work within, or structures or systems to work to. But we will also provide step-by-step processes to help facilitate that discussion and active participation within the group, and actually encourage certain dialogue. So you will provide children sometimes with prompts of things that they can say to encourage that co-creation element within the group, with the ultimate aim being that the group as a whole construct their own knowledge for themselves. The term scaffolding itself was actually first used by Wood, Bruner and Ross when they were doing a piece of work with preschoolers. And the term scaffolding came up when they were talking about young children trying to solve a block problem, so reconstructing using blocks. Now, Bruner took this a step further and got quite involved in this process, and he highlighted in his research the importance of the teacher within that process. He was very much an advocate that the teacher was a major part of the process, and it was the teacher's interactions with the children and the scaffolding they provided that helped make those gains. He also then went into things around the spiral curriculum, around that children can learn anything if it's pitched at the right level, and that the spiral element of the curriculum allows the children to come back to that piece of knowledge. Another big player in the world of scaffolding is Lev Vygotsky, who outlines scaffolding as a tool for growth within children. His philosophy worked along the same lines in that children would need small steps that are manageable for them to reach their end goal, and that they have to work in collaboration with what he termed as a skilled instructor or a more knowledgeable peer. So under Lev Vygotsky's thinking, that more knowledgeable person doesn't necessarily have to be a teacher, it can be another child. Now, this was big news at the time, because the main learning theories at the time were Piaget, who very much talked about children being at the right age and stage for learning to happen. Whereas Vygotsky was all about children could reach that knowledge at any age or stage as long as it was modelled and scaffolded in the correct manner for them. Vygotsky's main piece of work was around the zone of proximal development. Now, this is a nice piece of research and a nice little learning theory that sits around the idea that children have got an inherent amount of knowledge and skill that they can work comfortably in, and they will work to their own ability, and that's that little blue circle, well, oval in the middle there, so what children can do on their own. What Vygotsky said was, when they work with a teacher or a more skilled peer, they can actually receive a boost to their knowledge and their understanding, and through dialogue, discussion and scaffolding, children can actually stretch themselves beyond what they could normally do and work in what he deemed as the zone of proximal development, so an area beyond their own general understanding and own level of ability to push their knowledge, to extend their knowledge further, and the children can make leaps in their education. A big element of this was that idea of social interaction, which both Brunner and Vygotsky felt was an important part of it. So Vygotsky argued that we learn best through a social environment, where we construct meaning through interaction with others, and he calls that collaborative dialogue. Brunner believed that children will start to learn those new concepts, but they'll learn them from teachers and other adults in the form of that support network. Now, this I think is really interesting in that one of the best maths lessons I ever saw actually used this kind of this way of working. So it was a year 4 class, one of my earlier classes when I was teaching, but we were having a maths problem solving day, and well, actually it was a maths problem solving week. But the first day, I provided a whole load of maths problems pitched at the right level for the children. But the idea was that they work individually on these math challenges. And if I'm being honest, it was a bit of a car crash. Because the children were sat there working on their own, and there was a handful of children that kind of worked their way through these pieces of work, and ultimately it just didn't work. Children were stuck. It just wasn't working at all. So day 2, I made the decision to redo the lesson, but this time round we do it as working groups. Now, I made the choice on the second day to have mixed groups. So we had mixed ability groups all over the classroom working on these problems. And we talked about how children should talk to each other. They would go through that metacognitive process of talking about what they knew, what they thought the question was asking, and to work their way through. Now, the way I pitched this to the children was that it was about how well their teams would work together. And I took the handful of children that had done all right with it the day before and put one of them in each of the groups. So there was at least one child in there who had managed to achieve something from the previous day. Then I, as a teacher, and my teaching assistant would be sitting with individual groups and kind of floating around the room to try and coax the children through. What happened on that day was just fabulous, though, because what I witnessed in that classroom that day was absolutely what Vygotsky was talking about, where what started off as one of the children in the group kind of leading the task and leading that problem solving for the group But what happened really quickly was, because they were having that discussion and that dialogue, and that was that element of collaborative dialogue, the children were starting to unpick the way the problems work and understanding how they could solve them together. And what started off as quite a quiet lesson on that second day, it's silent at first, turned out to be a really buzzy, working chatter noise within the classroom. And slowly they started to solve these problems. And then that pace picked up and up and up. And by the end of the hour lesson that we were doing, they were absolutely whizzing through these problems. And they couldn't get through them quick enough. At the end of the lesson, we then had a conversation as a class on what they thought had happened and what had happened the previous day. And what came out from the children was that they'd much preferred day number 2 because they'd had the opportunity to talk and explore the questions. What was really interesting, however, was what those 5 children that had done all right the day before had said about it. Because, one, they'd enjoyed the whole experience more because it had been more social. But 2, they also commented how, basically what I saw, that they started off as being almost the kind of leader within the group. But what had happened really quickly is that other people had started to develop their understanding and develop their knowledge, and that they'd started to share kind of that leadership role. So that while it started with one person, it moved around the group then for other people to take the lead. And the confidence that the children had at the end of that day was absolutely fabulous. And it really was the start of what was quite a big movement for that class within their maths understanding and their maths education. And it was brilliant to watch. And the thing is, you'll see that again and again when you get children talking and collaborating through scaffolded activities. Because that's the important bit, that children have this ability to make big leaps in their learning, but it's about making sure that you put the right elements in that learning journey for them to make those steps, getting those steps right. How do you do it? Well, one of the main ways of doing it is modelling. And that's modelling through discussion and asking pointed questions to draw the learning out of the children. That questioning process is really important because actually what you're doing is you're talking about your own thought processes, you're modelling metacognition, but what you're doing as well is you are asking the right questions at the right time that build on children's prior knowledge and unpick it so they can make the steps for themselves. Another thing you can do is chunk the work down. So if there's a massive piece of work to be done, break it down into sections. Break it down into structured bits that the children will develop a bit at a time. So for example, when my year 2s are doing any extended writing, or rather they're going to do some extended writing, what I have a tendency to do is I'll break it down into, so day 1 we will write the introduction, day 2 we'll write a second section to the story and build it up through the week until by the end of the week they've got a whole story that's been written, but each bit has been done and done with care so that it grows and flows together. Whereas if I was doing a piece of writing with my year 2s and I just said, right, you've got an hour, write where you can, they don't get the same quality. You don't necessarily get the thought and time that goes into it when you chunk it down and you give children scaffolded structure for them to work through. And the other element is you provide frameworks. So if you want the children to do a report, then you give them a framework that tells them what they need to do, what goes in each section of that report, so that they don't have to have that knowledge and that thought process, but they can build it up. And it doesn't take very long for children to work through with frameworks until they start to internalise them and they don't need the framework moving forward. The other side of it is you need to be aware, though, that it's not just about different outcomes for children, because it's not differentiation, it's about structure, it's about providing the scaffolding for those children to be able to get to the endpoint at the same endpoint as the rest of their group. An interesting one to have a look at if this is something that is interesting to you, and to look at that scaffolding is Barack Rosenshine's 17 Principles of Effective Instruction. I'm sure you'll look at this again later on in the year and possibly even one of these podcasts. But looking at these 17 steps, they're really useful principles to work through if you are thinking about scaffolding for your children. Okay, starting with a short review of their knowledge, what do they know? Looking at the small steps that students need to make to be able to do it effectively. I'll let you have a look at them at your own leisure. Okay. So, to finish, I'm going to go through the other things that we can do. So those worked examples. So worked examples is just another form of scaffolding. And it's something that I use an awful lot with my children when I'm working. Now, there's three types of worked examples: correct examples, partial examples, and incorrect examples. And they're useful to work through with children. And actually, in this order makes sense as well. So, we will go through an example of a correct example. So, let's start with the question. 13 out of 9. So 13 out of 9 goes beyond our 10 barrier. So in year 2, when I was working with my children, we would have to do some partitioning, because 13 out of 9 we can't do, but what we can do is we can partition the 9 to help us with our number bonds to 10. So 13. What do we need to add to 13 to take it to our next 10? 7. 7 and 3 make 10. So we'll split our 9, we'll partition that 9 into a 7, and what's left over is our 2. Then we can do the adding up. There's our 13. So start of our number line. We add 7 to that, it takes us up to 20. We add our 2 that's left over, and that takes us to 22. We would recap that again and again using different numbers, but until the children got that idea. They would then be sent off to do their work, and they would potentially have number lines with jumps on and spaces for children to do the partitioning, or using a part-whole model. A partial example is very similar, but there's just some gaps. So we're modelling the thinking and we're modelling the activity and how it works, but the children are then going to be asked the questions. So what's missing? If we've got our 13, we know the partition is 7, so what are we going to add on that first jump to take us to our next 10? Brilliant, that's 20. And what have we got left over to add on? That's our 2, that takes us to 22. Now my favourite of these, however, is the incorrect example, because this is where Mr. Bell or Mr. B looks silly in front of the children, and they get the opportunity to show me how clever they are. So 13 add 9, so we need to do some partitioning, right? So 13 and 7, that's a partition, and 2's left over. Now the children at this point would be putting their hand up going, that's not right, that's not right. I would, however, choose to ignore them at this point until I get to my question. So there I am, 13 on the bottom of my number line. I'm going to add 2, at which point the hands are up, the hands are shaking, and everybody's shouting, Mr. B, we need to sort this out. But we carry on until we get to the end of the question. Now, at which point the children are far too excited to tell me that this is wrong, so we would then have to do something about it. And the children would actually then model for me how they would work that through. So I'd rub the numbers out, and they would take me through the example until it was right. Now, that was a really brief introduction to scaffolding. It is something that you will do an awful lot of in the classroom, just naturally. But it is worth looking at some of the theories around there to help you understand that slightly more. So you might want to look at the classics like Vygotsky and Brunner. Okay, thank you very much for listening, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you soon.